if your product is accessible and there's 3 other products that are out and they're all bidding for the same business, and compliance is an issue or a concern, and the other ones don't have it, and you do, and your price and features are essentially the same, they're going to pick the accessibility one.
Hi, and welcome to the HearSay podcast. I'm your host, Mike Paciello, Chief Accessibility Officer here at AudioEye. I'm joined today again by another one of my favorite friends and colleagues, Jeff Kline. He's a former manager of accessibility consulting, compliance, and strategic programs at IBM, and also the author of Strategic IT Accessibility, Enabling the Organization. He's been involved in the accessibility industry for almost as long as I have, but for decades now, and has some incredible insights around accessibility in IT and development within your organization. Hey, Jeff, it's as always great to be talking to you.
Good to see you, Mike.
We've touched a little bit on your background, in the intro, but can you give us just kind of the 30,000 foot view of your career and how you got started in accessibility?
Yeah. Well, I studied industrial design in school and was a industrial designer and design manager at IBM. And that's where I got kind of exposed to it on the hardware side, the usability side, looking at displays and keyboards and a lot of the ergonomic things. And then I left the hardware side and went over and learned about software. I became a software development manager for IBM's Unix product called AIX. And over there, it was around the year 2000 where everybody was very nervous about the pending 508 regulations that were going to be coming up very shortly. And so I got exposed to that, and my team was actually developing in just pure Java on the user interface for system management over there. So I worked on that for a while, and then I got offered a position in IBM Research doing as a manager for accessibility, compliance, and consulting. They had their whole group over there came out of the research organization. I had the development background experience and some knowledge of accessibility. So when I went over and started to put that program in place for all the, different business areas and tools and training and compliance measurements, et cetera, et cetera. And then I left there in 2009 and I took a job as the program director of statewide accessibility for the state of Texas.
Right. Yeah, I remember that.
I had a lot of exposure over there in a lot of different areas. I was doing rulemaking and lots of fun things like that. And then I left in 2021, I think, and I've been doing consulting ever since in public and private sector.
Let's talk a little bit about, I think, where your great strengths have been, especially over the last 15, 20 years. And that's really kind of aligned with your book, right? Your book on strategic IT accessibility kind of touches on how to bring accessibility into an organization's IT department. So what do you feel? What do you see as some of the biggest takeaways for professionals where, IT and strategic IT is concerned in an organization?
So, I'm a big proponent of tops down accessibility. Very, very difficult for somebody down in the trenches who knows it and is passionate about it to get that message up into the upper echelons of the organization so the leadership can get a grasp of it, start to understand it, and help build the program. Because the person that's down in the ranks, they're busy doing coding and debugging and testing and things like that. And a lot of times they really don't even have a lot of knowledge in terms of what it takes to drive a program of that scale, across an organization. So, I would argue that if you don't have somebody in the organization that has that expertise, it would be beneficial to go out and bring somebody in to work with you to help build the presentation, at least to get that in front of management and start to get them to understand what it is, why it's important, and start to build the program a little bit.
Who's that within the organization? Who's doing that kind of knowledge building, knowledge sharing?
Within the organization.
Yeah. Especially, I mean, if you're looking at it from the top, top down notion as you're, as you're explaining it, we're talking about the C-level folks by and large, are we not?
Yeah,
Right? You've got to get buy-in at that level. So who
absolutely.
is it that's presenting to them?
Well, presenting to them, if you're able to, build it up and get that done autonomously, that would be good. But I feel like a lot of times you have to bring somebody in from the outside, to come in, build the program. And a lot of times it's easier to get a consultant in front of your executives than it is to get, to try to get somebody, because there's a lot of political implications. Some people don't want to be bothered. Hey, this is interfering with my work. We don't have budget for that. You get a lot of barriers. And so once you bring a consultant in, and now you've got a higher level, and can really get the ears of these guys when you need to.
So we'll move from there to 2025. So here we are. We're headed into some interesting waters here in the United States. Where do you think organizations are when it comes to prioritizing accessibility in their IT strategy in 2025? Are we going to see it? Is the game going to be upped? Is it going to be lowered? Is it going to stay the same? What do you think?
Well, as you know, the DOJ just passed rules for, well, not just passed, I guess they're 6, 8 months, maybe a year old by now, for public sector entities, which is, so much stuff. And so those guys are all scrambling around trying to figure out what to do and how to do it. And, a lot of them don't even have policy. But, given that they're required to do that, and assuming that, their feet get held to the fire, and all of the most of the IT that they use is procured, that's going to start driving the whole IT ecosystem that serves the public sector to try to improve their compliance posture of their products and services. So that's kind of where I see things going. I think it's
So
a big step to drive that.
yeah, so we'll see. It'll be more visible. It remains to see where it lies in the terms of prioritization. Is it number one? Is it 10? Is it in the top 10? Right?
I think it'll be in the top 10. I don't think it's going to be, the top. I mean, when you think about cybersecurity and privacy and things like that, it's very difficult to get it up into that. But I always position accessibility as privacy, security. It's a compliance item. And so when you start thinking about it as a compliance item, I think it gets a little bit more traction. The other thing that I've noticed is accessibility is a word, but to most people it's still in the abstract, because they know that it requires a set of standards, but they don't really have a feel for the barriers that somebody has when they try to use something that's not accessible. And so the more you can get people with disabilities out there to go on to, somebody's website and get their CEO or their head of IT in there to watch how horrible it is and how frustrating it is, and unable to complete, just the simplest tasks because their products or services are not accessible. That's very telling. And then they start to get it a little bit more.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. I was just going to ask you. So, what do you think some of the misconceptions are about accessibility in this industry, where IT strategy particularly is concerned?
They're ignorant. They don't know what they don't know. They'll I wish I had a quarter for every time somebody submitted a bid and they said, oh yeah, we're gonna, yes, of course we do accessibility. And you start probing a few questions, really basic accessibility stuff, and you find out they don't know anything about it, but they're agreeing and telling their customers, oh yeah, we know how to do that, that'll be included. But it's not. And then nobody finds out until the product is delivered, and then you have a problem.
Is there a way to change that, that ignorance, to move past some of those misconceptions?
Well, Again, I think the compliance thing is going to help, and the people that know accessibility, they're in the higher level positions, can be instrumental in that. For example, when I was with the state of Texas, we would have a cooperative contract solicitation for vendors that did website development. And I created a form that is still in use today, and anybody can use it, called the VATS, or the Vendor Accessibility Development Services Information Request. A couple of basic questions: do you have a policy on accessibility? What kind of training do your people have? Do you have tools? What do you do in the instances where there's issues? And the last one is provide some examples of some websites or some products that you've made accessible. And it takes about 35 to 40 seconds to go through that and know whether a vendor has any idea of what that is. And if they didn't, then they were excluded from getting a contract.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Let's switch gears just a little bit. Put your, consulting hat on, so to speak. You've been in that space now for a number of years. What are some of the trends that you're seeing amongst organizations, or either just getting started in the accessibility space or looking to enhance
it? Well, they're starting to get that accessibility is not just about fixing websites or fixing, whatever the product is. And there's things that they have control over, which is the things that they develop internally, or their content, whether it's, documents, et cetera. And there's things that are much more difficult to control, which are the products and services that they buy externally. So, there is that that notion that they're starting on that. The first thing out of the box, and I've talked about this many times, is organizations need to have a policy. And once you can get a policy in place, and it doesn't have to be some big, long, lengthy thing, what's IBM corporate instruction 130 something or other. It's like a paragraph and a half, but that can drive the organization. Then you have to figure out what to do. And when you're starting to figure out what to do, that's where all these new what I would call maturity models are coming into place. There's several of them. I developed one back in Texas with my counterparts in Minnesota and Massachusetts. Some of the other competitors have their own. We're working on one at the W3C, which is going to be, it's not only a maturity model where you can look at these parameters or proof points of what needs to be done specifically, but you can actually use it to develop an overall product plan for your organization. So it's twofold, and I think that's what organizations are really going to need, is these. They don't know where to start. They need some kind of guidance.
Right. So policy one, then from there develop an AMM, an accessibility maturity model. Third step, where do you go from there? I mean, implementation seems to be obvious, but what would you say?
Well, so the maturity model, you have to remember, doesn't make products compliant, right? You still have to do those steps. You have to make sure that you've got training. You've got to make sure that you've got accessibility integrated into your development processes, and certainly in your procurement processes and contracts. And that can be obviously going on simultaneously, but you still need to have the buy-in, and you need to make sure that people include it in their budgets. A lot of times they don't want to add another 10% for accessibility. Well, it's only 10% the first time you do it. And if you retain your staff, you've got all that learning under your belt. And the next time you do it, it's much easier. It needs to be baked in.
Yeah. So now we're moving from the AMM to basically the SDLC, right? Software Development Lifecycle.
Yeah.
As you're looking at it, and then as you said, once you refine that and you integrate accessibility, whether it's procurement processes, testing, what have you, design, all the way across the board, when you refine that and you fine tune it, then you come out with at least a development process or a manufacturing process, depending on what kind of business you're in. And now you make all three of you make that work. You make it work more smoothly, and accessibility becomes ingrained into the organizational environment, which is really what the purpose of the AMM is all about, right? It's strategy. It's an organizational strategy
Yeah.
that provides direction, at that level. That sound right?
Yes, that's
Yeah.
absolutely spot on.
Yeah, awesome. That's great. So we know here at AudioEye that sometimes we come across IT professionals and they're busy. They've got a million things, on their plate, and they don't understand, as you kind of alluded to earlier, about the importance of digital accessibility. So, what do you do again as a professional? What do you do to try to, you know, get that elephant to dance? How do you get them to move?
Well, you have to try to get if you come in midstream into a project, it's already too late. So you have to get them to integrate the requirements right when the requirements phase of the project is going on. And once you have the requirements in there, the other struggle is to keep them in, because you've got these product managers, for example, and they're dealing with hundreds of trade-offs a day. And my customers want this, but the excess it can be prioritized out if so you have to kind of stay on it, and don't assume that it's just gonna be there, because ultimately there are folks that don't understand. They're not getting measured on accessibility, they're getting measured on making a profit. And these functions and features are going to make more of a profit. And accessibility, it's a risk mitigation to a lot of them.
Yeah. Yeah. Again, going back to what you said earlier, it's compliance. No matter how you slice and dice it, it's always about compliance. And always the challenge that I found was whenever compliance is the factor, it immediately puts an organization or a business on the defense, right? Because they're trying to say compliance equals cost of doing business. It's not generating new revenue, right? So unless you are a business that advises or otherwise makes products around that notion of compliance, so security, privacy, accessibility, right?
Yeah.
Those kind of things. So yeah, that's kind of interesting. So I want to take this into one more department that I know you've got experience in. I have a little bit less experience, on a professional level. How do we bring this knowledge set that you have, the strategic IT kind of, notion and mindset for accessibility, to marketing, into the marketing and marketing research departments? And then how do we get them to get engaged and act on it?
Well, there's marketing, and then there's marketing communications, right? I kind of look at marketing communications as a little bit of a separate entity. They have they can weave it into their messaging a little bit easier, especially when they're talking to their customers. And hey, by the way, look, our product does all these different things, and we comply with security, and by the way, we also make sure that our product is accessible. And not only will that help enable anybody who's in that diversity group, which is the only diversity group that requires technology to be able to do whatever it is they need to do digitally, and kind of drive it in that direction. So you can, um, if your product is accessible and there's three other products that are out and they're all bidding for the same business, and compliance is an issue or a concern, and the other ones don't have it and you do, and your price and features are essentially the same, they're going to pick the accessibility one. And again, selling it as a risk mitigation, right? These other guy, you don't want to bring this other products into your company, because you could end up being sued because they're not accessible, they're not compliant. This one is. But
Yeah.
as we all know, we have to be very careful about how much compliance products truly have.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. We need to be fully involved and fully aware where we stand, where our products are. It occurred to me as you were talking, I feel like what we're really discussing here is the normalization of accessibility, where the technologies that we develop um, are involved, right? So, thinking back, I literally was had this kind of fast forward kind of, or maybe it was fast backwards, thinking of commercials that I've seen over the last 5, 6, 7 years, particularly by IBM, by Microsoft, by Google, by McDonald's, by Walmart, by Target. And what I'm speaking to is now in many commercials, you see people with disabilities in those commercials. 10, 15, 20 years ago, that was a rare occurrence, right?
Yeah.
It's become normal. It's become normal so much so that it's almost invisible. It's almost like, yeah, there's a person in a wheelchair there, or there's a blind person there, but yeah, they're just part of the group. They're just part of the crowd, part of that picture. Apple did a fantastic commercial that I've always loved, where they did something, but it was a little bit more focused on disabilities. So I'm looking at more mainstream type of commercials that we see. It
Yeah.
sounds like that's what you're talking about. That's what marketing needs to make a goal of, normalizing the notion of accessibility so that it's no longer a special feature. It just is.
That's right. Absolutely. It's just part of the product, just like, everything else. I don't know, Mike, if you remember back in the days where, a lot of the assistive technology hardware couldn't function because you had to write special programs and everything to make head trackers
Yeah.
and different
Everything
keyboard.
was proprietary. Everything was proprietary, and you had to have a license for it. Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
And now it's built into the OSs, and it's done, right? You can just go buy a head tracker or something that reduces mouse tremors, and it works. It just
Yeah.
works.
Yeah, yeah, and again, I think this is one of the great things we kind of have as an industry and a profession made great leaps and bounds. Because when you and I first started, everything was hardware. Everything was hardware. There was no software.
Yeah.
There were no screen readers. The screen readers and the original screen readers were not the IBM screen reader that Jim and Rich were working on. They were hardware on a board, right? That came out of some of the other companies. Now everything is software. Now everything is smart. Now everything is AI engineered. So it's just a whole different environment. And accessibility is there. It has a part. It has a play. I just think something that you said earlier is very important. Ignorance right now is still high. It really is, and we need to do a much better job of teaching, and building on the knowledge in those market marketing IT firms and research organizations, and let them start to now build that into the organizational structures you said, top down, and message it out.
Yes.
Yeah,
Totally agree.
yeah. I should sell my own stuff. I mean, I just
Yeah. Yeah. I think you should.
imagine that, I have my own podcast. So hey, so you and I are looking at 2025. What do you see? What do you think our big wins are going to be? Where do you think your system is going to be as we move into this year?
Well, I think it's got to move more into the medium businesses. I think the major players in IT, the big guys, are paying attention. Apple's, they've invested billions of dollars. IBM's got a lot of money in theirs, but it's a different kind of a company with all the different, business units and acquisitions that are very, very challenging to do that. But a lot of the other companies, HP and Microsoft, they're all on the path, and I think that what you're going to see is you're going to see the others as they get more involved, and as the compliance climate, the regulatory compliance gets stronger, they're going to start to follow suit on that. And they're going to say, oh, what is Microsoft doing? Why is this? How do we get there? And I think it will start to take on a life of its own.
Yeah, I see. I see definitely some light at the end of the tunnel where that's concerned. I really appreciate it. I'd like to see obviously more advances, more involvement where accessibility is infused in the AI world. Um, I'd like to see a lot more talked about just in terms of the AR, VR, type technologies. I see them as being a big um, opportunity to advance the messaging that we're talking about through marketing. If we did a lot more at that level, I wonder where we would be just in terms of making some, getting some big wins overall. Leadership, I think, is still something we kind of need. And when I say leadership, I'm not necessarily talking about organizational leadership, but I mean big sky leadership. Everybody needs a Martin Luther King, and
Yeah.
I think we've missed that. I don't know that we've had that kind of leadership in a long time. Maybe going back to the Alan Brightman, Jim Thatcher type days. Individuals who were really well respected and looked up to, and could lead us where we need to be. Do you think that that's something that we can, I don't know, focus on or make a goal of?
I do, and the interesting thing is I don't think that the leaders in accessibility have to be fully trained and be experts in, building accessibility. They just have to understand it, be able to carry the message, support the people below them that are trying to drive this stuff, and help them, clear the roadblocks of anybody that gets in the way, and be able to talk the language of the C-level suite.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, very well stated, Jeff. Hey, Jeff, thanks so much for joining us today. As always, it's been great to work with you. It's incredible to have you on the show, and I'm really excited to see where you're going, what you'll be doing over these next couple of years. I know we're going to bump into each other as we have over the next few months, so let's make sure we touch base.
Absolutely.
HearSay is produced by Sojin Rank, Mike Barton, Mariella, Paulino, and Missy Jensen. Edited by Alex Dorrier. If you enjoyed this podcast and don't want to miss future episodes, subscribe to our YouTube channel. Thanks again for joining us, and we'll see you next time.